Most people, when they imagine what happens after someone hurts an empath badly enough, picture something predictable: tears, withdrawal, maybe eventual anger. What actually happens is stranger than that and far less talked about because the real transformation that follows doesn't look like damage at all. It looks, disturbingly, like an upgrade. Today we're walking through exactly what happens inside an empath after they've been genuinely hurt. Not the parts everyone expects, but the parts that actually surprise people, including the empaths themselves. Let's start with the assumption almost everyone carries into this topic, because it shapes everything that follows. The belief that hurting a deeply feeling, deeply compassionate person breaks something in them permanently, that their sensitivity, their openness, their willingness to trust gets damaged in a way that leaves them smaller, more guarded, more diminished than before. This assumption isn't entirely wrong, in the sense that something does change. But what actually changes, and how, tends to surprise almost everyone who witnesses it up close, because it rarely moves in the direction people expect. Here's the first surprising thing that happens. Instead of becoming less perceptive, hurt empaths often become dramatically more perceptive, not about people in general, but specifically about the exact category of behavior that hurt them. This is worth understanding carefully, because it explains a pattern almost everyone who's spent time around a hurt empath has noticed without quite naming it. Before the hurt, an empath's perception operates broadly, generously, extending trust and charitable interpretation across a wide range of behavior. After a genuine, significant hurt, that broad perception often narrows and sharpens dramatically around the specific pattern that caused the damage, meaning a person hurt by dishonesty develops an almost eerie ability to detect dishonesty in new people, sometimes within minutes of meeting them, long before any concrete evidence exists. A person hurt by inconsistency develops a similarly precise radar for unreliability, picking up on tiny behavioral tells most people would never consciously register. This isn't damage, it's specialization. The pain didn't make them less perceptive. It trained an already sensitive system on a very specific data set, producing an expertise that, however painfully it was acquired, becomes genuinely useful for the rest of their life. The second surprising thing: hurt empaths frequently develop a much healthier relationship with their own anger than they had before, rather than becoming more suppressed or conflict avoidant, which is what most people expect. Before significant hurt, many empaths have spent years, sometimes their entire lives, treating anger as something dangerous, something to swallow, something that threatens the harmony they've always felt responsible for maintaining. But genuine deep hurt has a strange way of finally giving that anger enough fuel to become undeniable, loud enough finally to break through decades of conditioning that told them their own anger was less important than everyone else's comfort. People who witness this shift often describe it as the empath becoming different almost overnight, and what they're actually witnessing is someone accessing an emotion they'd been taught to suppress their entire life, now finally strong enough to override that suppression. The third surprising thing, and this one confuses people close to the empath more than almost anything else: they often become significantly less agreeable, in the literal psychological sense of that word, and this change tends to stick around permanently rather than fading once the immediate pain passes. Agreeableness, as a personality trait, involves prioritizing harmony, cooperation, and others' comfort, often at real cost to your own needs. A significant hurt frequently produces a measurable, lasting decrease in this trait, not because the person has become unkind, but because the specific mechanism that made them so endlessly accommodating has been directly, painfully proven to be exploitable, and something in their psychology adjusts accordingly, permanently recalibrating how much automatic deference they extend to other people's preferences over their own. The fourth surprising thing: rather than losing faith in connection altogether, which is what people often predict, hurt empaths frequently develop a much more accurate, much more selective model of who's actually capable of real intimacy, and their existing close relationships often deepen significantly as a result. This happens because the energy that used to get spread thin across many surface-level connections, maintained partly out of habit and partly out of an inability to say no, gets redirected specifically toward the handful of relationships that already demonstrated real reciprocity. People who witness a hurt empath from a distance sometimes worry they're becoming isolated or bitter, when what's actually happening is a kind of relational pruning, cutting away the connections that were never nourishing in the first place, in order to let the genuinely good ones finally receive the fuller attention they always deserved. The fifth surprising thing, and the one that ties everything else together, hurt empaths often develop a genuinely new relationship with their own solitude, discovering, sometimes for the first time in their lives, that being alone doesn't actually feel like the emergency they always assumed it would. Before significant hurt, many empaths structure their entire lives around avoiding solitude, filling every possible gap with social contact, partly because connection genuinely nourishes them, but partly because being alone with their own thoughts, without anyone else's needs to organize themselves around, has always felt strangely uncomfortable. After being hurt badly enough that some relationships genuinely can't continue, many empaths discover, almost by necessity, that the solitude they were avoiding is actually far more peaceful, far more restorative than they ever expected. And this discovery often becomes one of the most permanent, positive changes to come out of an otherwise painful experience. I want to be honest about something before we go further, because this entire episode could easily be read as suggesting that being hurt is secretly good for you, and that's not quite the right conclusion to draw. The pain itself is real, and it's not something to romanticize or rush past. What's actually being described here isn't the pain was worth it in some tidy, redemptive sense. It's something more specific and more useful. Pain, when it's genuinely metabolized rather than avoided, tends to produce very particular, very predictable psychological adaptations, and understanding what those adaptations actually are, rather than assuming pain simply diminishes a person, gives you a much more accurate picture of what recovery from real hurt actually looks like when it's happening well. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What determines whether these changes unfold in a healthy direction toward sharper discernment, cleaner boundaries, and deeper remaining relationships versus an unhealthy direction where the same raw material curdles into permanent suspicion, isolation, or an inability to ever trust again? Because the surprise in this episode's title isn't just that hurt empaths change in unexpected ways. It's that the direction of that change is far more within their control than most people, including many empaths themselves, ever realize while they're still in the middle of it. Let's talk about what actually determines the direction of this change, because this is the piece that turns everything we discussed in the first half from an interesting observation into something genuinely useful, something you can actually influence rather than simply wait to see how it unfolds. Here's the core distinction, and I want to state it plainly before we go into the mechanics of it. The difference between healthy adaptation and unhealthy calcification almost never comes down to how much someone was hurt, or how long the hurt lasted, or even how severe the betrayal was. It comes down to whether the pain gets processed consciously, with support over time, or whether it gets buried, avoided, and simply managed from a distance through increasingly rigid defenses. The same raw material, the exact same injury, can produce a sharper, wiser, more discerning person on one path, and a guarded, isolated, permanently suspicious person on the other. The difference isn't the wound. It's what happens to it afterward. Let's walk through the first fork in that road, because it shows up almost immediately, often within the first few weeks after the hurt occurs. The difference between naming the specific pattern that caused harm versus generalizing it into a blanket rule about people as a whole. This distinction sounds subtle, but it determines almost everything that follows. A person who processes their hurt well tends to arrive at something specific. That person lied to me repeatedly, and I'm now much better at detecting that particular pattern in others. A person who processes it poorly tends to arrive at something global. People lie, people can't be trusted, connection itself is dangerous. The first conclusion sharpens perception while leaving the door open to future intimacy. The second conclusion closes the door almost entirely, using the specific injury as evidence for a much broader, much more corrosive belief that ends up protecting against connection altogether, rather than simply protecting against the specific behavior that actually caused harm. This matters enormously because the sharpened perception we talked about in the first half of this episode, the eerie ability to detect dishonesty or inconsistency or manipulation, is only a genuine gift when it stays specific. The moment it generalizes into nobody can be trusted, it stops being useful discernment and starts being a wall that keeps out exactly the kind of people who would have actually been safe to let in. The second fork in the road involves what happens to the newly accessed anger we discussed earlier, whether it gets integrated as information or whether it calcifies into a permanent operating stance. Healthy integration looks like this. The anger arrives, gets acknowledged, gets used to inform a real boundary or a real decision, and then gradually softens into something closer to clarity rather than ongoing rage. It served its purpose, breaking through years of suppression, finally giving the person permission to protect themselves, and once that purpose is served, it doesn't need to remain at full volume indefinitely. Unhealthy calcification looks different. The anger, having finally broken through after years of suppression, becomes the new default lens through which every future interaction gets filtered, regardless of whether the specific situation actually warrants that same intensity. This is exhausting to sustain, and it often ends up harming new relationships that had nothing to do with the original injury, simply because the anger never got a chance to settle into something more precise and situational. The third fork involves the decreased agreeableness we talked about, whether it stabilizes into healthy assertiveness or whether it overcorrects into rigid, reflexive defensiveness. Healthy stabilization looks like someone who can still say yes generously when they genuinely want to, but who can also say no clearly, without guilt, when something doesn't serve them. A person whose accommodation is now a choice rather than a compulsion. Overcorrection looks like someone who has swung so far in the other direction that every request, even reasonable ones from genuinely trustworthy people, gets treated with suspicion or reflexive refusal, as though saying yes to anything risks reopening the exact vulnerability that got exploited before. This overcorrection often confuses the people who actually deserve the empath's continued generosity because they end up being punished, in a sense, for a pattern of harm they had nothing to do with. The fourth fork involves the relational pruning we discussed, whether it results in a smaller but genuinely nourishing circle or whether it results in near total isolation disguised as selectivity. This is one of the more dangerous forks because from the outside, both outcomes can look remarkably similar in the early stages: fewer friends, less socializing, more time alone. The distinguishing factor, again, comes down to whether the remaining relationships are actually being nurtured actively with real effort and real vulnerability, or whether the pruning simply continued unchecked until almost nothing remained. At which point the language of quality over quantity becomes a story told to justify an isolation that was never actually a deliberate, healthy choice in the first place. And the fifth fork involves the newfound comfort with solitude, whether it becomes a genuine, healthy capacity that coexists alongside continued connection, or whether it becomes a permanent retreat that gradually replaces connection altogether. Healthy solitude looks like someone who genuinely enjoys their own company, who no longer panics at the prospect of an empty weekend, but who still, actively, chooses connection when it's available and meaningful. Unhealthy retreat looks like someone who has discovered solitude is more comfortable than the risk of ever being hurt again, and who begins avoiding connection altogether, not because they've become genuinely self-sufficient, but because the fear of repeating the original injury has quietly become larger than the desire for genuine intimacy ever was. So what actually determines which fork gets taken at each of these 5 points? This is the part that matters most, and it comes down to a few specific identifiable factors, rather than something vague like resilience or strength, words that don't actually explain anything useful. The first factor is whether the hurt gets processed with someone else, a therapist, a genuinely safe friend, a support group, anyone capable of reflecting the experience back with enough distance and care to prevent it from calcifying in isolation. Processing pain entirely alone, without any outside perspective, dramatically increases the likelihood of generalization because there's nothing available to gently challenge the broadening of a specific injury into a global belief about people as a whole. Even one person who can say gently, "That sounds like it was specifically about them, not about everyone," can be the difference between sharpened discernment and permanent suspicion. The second factor is time, specifically enough time without forcing artificial closure. A lot of unhealthy calcification happens because someone rushes the process, deciding within weeks that they've figured out what happened and moving into a rigid new stance before the actual emotional work of grieving, understanding, and integrating the experience has had a chance to unfold naturally. The specific versus global distinction, the anger as information versus anger as identity distinction, these things often only resolve properly with real time, measured in months rather than weeks, and rushing toward a tidy conclusion too quickly tends to lock in whatever conclusion happened to be available at that early, still raw stage. The third factor, and maybe the most important, whether at least one new low-stakes experience of trustworthy connection happens during the recovery period, providing direct, lived evidence that the new discernment can coexist with genuine intimacy rather than requiring its complete avoidance. This doesn't need to be dramatic. It can be something as simple as a new friend who consistently follows through on small commitments or an existing relationship that responds well to a newly stated boundary. But without at least one piece of concrete, positive evidence like this, the recovering empath has nothing to counterbalance the pull toward connection itself is what's dangerous. Because every available data point still points backward toward the original injury. I want to say something important as we bring this to a close because I think it reframes the entire two-part conversation we've had today. The surprise in this episode's title was never really about the specific changes themselves, the sharper perception, the accessible anger, the decreased agreeableness, the relational pruning, the newfound comfort with solitude. The real surprise is this. These changes are not something that simply happens to a hurt empath, passively, the way damage happens to something fragile. They're a genuine crossroads, arriving 5 separate times, at which the direction is influenced heavily by conscious choices, available support, and enough patient time. Meaning the person going through this has far more agency over the outcome than the popular narrative of hurt people just become guarded would ever suggest. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through today better than any explanation could. Picture a blacksmith's forge, and inside it, a piece of raw iron being heated until it glows, until it becomes soft enough, malleable enough to actually be shaped into something new. This heat is not gentle, it's intense, uncomfortable, the kind of process that would genuinely damage the iron if it were mishandled at exactly the wrong moment. And here is the exact point where everything depends on what happens next, because iron at this temperature can become one of two very different things, depending entirely on what's done to it while it's still glowing. In the hands of someone who understands the process, that same heated iron gets shaped deliberately, patiently, struck at precisely the right moments, folded and worked until it becomes something genuinely stronger than the raw material ever was on its own. A blade that holds an edge, a tool that lasts generations, structurally superior to the unshaped ore it started as, specifically because of what the heat and the careful shaping made possible. But in the absence of that careful shaping, if the same white-hot iron simply gets left alone, unattended, cooling without direction, without any deliberate hand guiding what it becomes, it doesn't become nothing. It becomes something too, but something brittle. Something that hardened into whatever accidental shape gravity and neglect happened to leave it in. Something that might look, from a distance, similarly strong, similarly formed by fire, but that shatters under exactly the kind of pressure the properly forged blade would have easily withstood. The heat itself was never the deciding factor. Both pieces of iron experienced the exact same fire. What determined whether the result was a blade or brittle scrap was entirely about what happened during the process, Whether skilled hands were present, whether the shaping happened with intention rather than neglect, whether enough time and care went into the folding and cooling rather than rushing the iron out of the forge the moment it seemed done. That is what happens inside a genuinely hurt empath, and it's the real answer to the question this entire two-part episode has been building toward. The fire is real, and it's not something anyone would choose, but what emerges from it, a sharper, wiser, more genuinely capable version of themselves, or a brittle, guarded shape that only looks strong until real pressure finally reveals otherwise, depends entirely on what happens during the process, not on the heat itself. And here's the quiet, hopeful truth underneath everything we've discussed today. Unlike iron, which has no say in how it's shaped, a person going through this fire retains real agency at every single step. The choice to process rather than isolate. The choice to seek reflection rather than draw conclusions alone. The choice to stay open to one piece of new evidence that connection is still possible, even while carrying every lesson the fire has already, rightfully, taught them. The forge doesn't decide what you become, it only provides the heat. What gets shaped inside it, that part, still, remarkably, belongs to you.